So we will review the lab on the respiratory system, and we're going to start with a brief overview of what respiratory system does. It delivers oxygen for the process of cellular respiration, and the result of this process, you can see, it generates ATP, molecules that are the short-term energy storage in the cell, and it also generates carbon dioxide, which we have to exhale. So carbon dioxide has to be exhaled in order to maintain not only proper levels of carbon dioxide, we also have to maintain proper levels of pH. You see these hydrogen ions? So what essentially happens when carbon dioxide interacts with water, it generates acid. In order for this acid not to lead to acidosis, we have to exhale all the excessive carbon dioxide from the body. And that's what lungs do. Respiratory system, that's what it does. It delivers oxygen and gets rid of carbon dioxide. So this overviews the anatomy of the respiratory system. You have up to terminal bronchiole, here, including terminal bronchiole, your nasal cavity, your pharynx, your trachea, bronchi, that's all conducting zone. And respiratory bronchiole and alveoli, they constitute respiratory zone. So several structures in your nasal cavity, nasal conchae, they increase the surface area. Sinuses help to your voice to resonate. Different parts of the pharynx represent conducting zone. Here you can see a little, that's larynx right here. That's where the vocal cords and epiglottis are found. Epiglottis essentially prevents food from going into the trachea, and vocal cords are responsible for the sounds of the voice. Here you can see trachea, the carina branches into bronchi, and bronchi undergo 23 branching events, becoming smaller and smaller, and they eventually lead to the structure that is called an alveolus. And in alveolus there is a gas exchange. So let's identify some structural parts. So first, paranasal sinuses. So that is a frontal sinus, sphenoid sinus, nostrils, obviously here, and nasal conchae. So these are this folds that increase the surface area. I'm going to remove it. And pharynx. So relatively small nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, different three parts of the throat. Now we're going to get rid of it again, okay? And epiglottis, you can see epiglottis here, and this is your larynx here, and you can see larynx on this image. And from larynx you can see, well, kind of, yeah, okay, so that would work, larynx and the trachea here. Now let's turn our attention to the lungs. So obviously right and left lung. Lungs consist of lobes, so if superior lobe here and superior lobe there. Right lung also has a middle and inferior lobe, and the left lung is only superior and inferior lobes. Left lung is smaller because of the heart. This depression right here is called a cardiac notch. Lungs sit on the diaphragm muscle, and accessory muscles that help you to breathe are intercostal muscles found between the ribs. Now bronchi. So let's take a look at this part of the image. So we have trachea, as I mentioned, and that's primary bronchi, two primary bronchi. Each leads to the corresponding lung, and then primary bronchi divide into the secondary. You can see a secondary bronchi. They lead to the lobes. And tertiary bronchi, they are colored on these images. They lead to pulmonary segments. So let's label left and right lung. So that's going to be a right lung and the left lung, and we know that we can tell them apart because, well, heart is on the left side, and you can clearly see heart, and the left lung is smaller. Diaphragm muscle right here, the trachea here, bronchi, that's primary bronchi. So trachea, is it anterior or posterior to esophagus? Well, if you would look at the image here and an anatomical image here, you can see that trachea is anterior to esophagus. So the answer is anterior. Frontal sinus, here, that's the one. Nasal conchae are the folds here. And epiglottis, you can see epiglottis right here. The function of epiglottis is to prevent food that you swallow when you swallow to go into your respiratory tract instead of digestive tract. Okay, bronchi, well, primary bronchi here. You can also see some lobar bronchi here. Larynx is here in the epiglottis. So we got this one. And rings of the hyaline cartilage found within the larynx and the trachea. The function of these rings of the cartilage is to provide the structural support so trachea and larynx do not collapse. So what is respiration? So external respiration is the gas exchange that occurs in the lungs. So in external respiration, carbon dioxide leaves the blood and gets into the alveoli and then being exhaled, while oxygen goes from the alveoli into the blood, okay, and gets delivered to the left side of the heart and then to the entire body. And this is the internal respiration. So in the internal respiration, oxygen leaves the blood and gets into the cells that require oxygen for cellular respiration, while CO2 leaves the cells, gets into the blood, and is taken to the right side of the heart and then into the pulmonary circulation. So what about histology of the respiratory system? Well, first, the thing that we are being asked here is to label the alveoli. So each of these pockets is the alveolus. You can not see the end, it's probably going something like this. Okay. So epithelial cells that construct alveoli, if you look at the walls, they are extremely flat. So epithelial cells that construct alveoli are squamous in shape, and there is only one layer of these cells. So that means that the epithelium that constructs alveoli is a simple squamous epithelium. Why it is simple squamous epithelium? Well, think of it this way. If you have a layer of extremely thin cells, and that's the alveolar side, and that's the blood side, then for oxygen and CO2, it will be very easy for oxygen to go from alveoli into blood because the barrier is pretty thin, And for CO2, it will be really easy to go from the blood into the alveoli and being exhaled. So that's the explanation. The respiratory membrane, the actual name of that structure, right here, that's the respiratory membrane. Okay, so respiratory membrane is thin in this case. So alveoli are in hundreds of millions. Why do we need? Well, they are very tiny, but since we have many alveoli, they provide an enormous amount of surface area. So the gas exchange to all that enormous amount of surface area can actually happen pretty quickly. So this is the epithelial lining of the trachea. Well, if you will look at the shape of the cells, you may clearly notice that these cells are essentially columnar in shape. Okay? They're also ciliated. You can see cilia here. Now, simple stratified or pseudostratified? That's a good question. Look at this nuclei. Here, here. That's basically one layer of nuclei. That is another layer of nuclei. Cells still form a single layer, but the single layer looks like it is stratified. So it's not really stratified, but looks like stratified, which means pseudostratified. So columnar, pseudostratified epithelium. So cilia that we labeled cilia, their function is to move the mucus. Now we obviously cannot listen to the lung sounds, so we have to skip it all together, but we can hypothesize how the CO2 that we exhale will affect the pH of the water. If you remember in the very beginning, and I understand it may be a bit of a... In the very beginning, we demonstrate that when we exhale, we produce CO2, and we also show that CO2, when it interacts with water, it produces hydrogen ion, which is essentially the acid. Now let's take a look at the question that we are so poised to ask. The question in this lab is how exhaled air will affect the pH of distilled water. And I suggest that the answer would be, well, it produces the acid, that the pH of the distilled water, when we exhale air into it, will go down, will become more acidic. So here you can see solutions that corresponds to acid, that corresponds to neutral. Well, imagine for a second that we have a cylinder, blue, sorry, we have a beaker with a water with some acid, some pH indicator. That pH normally in the neutral water will be blue, and then we keep blowing into it. Well, we don't do it, but okay. So control the one that we do not blow into. It's going to be blue, and final color will be blue. Okay, we'll actually do something really cool. So what I'm going to do here, the original color, right, will be what? Will be blue. And initial color will be also blue in our experimental group, but once we exhale some air into it, the color will change to green. Because pH changed, it became more acidic, and this is what we see, yellow/greenish color. It's really hard to, don't have the proper. So what effect did exhaled air had on the pH of distilled water? So that's the first question. Well, pH went down. Our initial hypothesis was supported. Which molecule is produced when carbon dioxide combines with the water? It's the molecule of carbonic acid. Now, if you take not the water but buffered solution that contains certain salts that can absorb sort of hydrogen ion and can prevent the abrupt change of the pH, then I don't think exhaled air would change the pH of a buffered solution. How could we test this hypothesis? We would take buffer solution and exhale into it. Potential sources of air, well, obviously we cannot control how much we exhale. Our measurements are generally imprecise. Improvements that can be made to this experiment probably control some kind of a volume that we exhale, something like that. The respiratory volumes, so this reviews volumes and capacities. So this is your tidal volume, okay? That tidal volume reflects tidal volume. Okay, let me see if I can. Okay, good. So tidal volume, it reflects your just breathing, normal breathing, day-to-day breathing. Inspiratory reserve volume, this one, shows you how much you can exhale on top of your normal tidal inhalation. Expiratory reserve volume shows you how much you can exhale after your normal exhalation. And this volume is the amount of air that is always staying in your lungs. It doesn't go anywhere. This is called residual volume. So sum of all four volumes gives you total lung capacity. Vital capacity is the air that you can actually move in or out of the lungs. You can see it here. Residual volume, it's untouchable for you. Inspiratory capacity, tidal plus inspiratory reserve. That's the amount of air that you can inspire after your normal exhalation. Functional residual capacity, that's the amount of air that stays in your lungs after your normal tidal exhalation. We can't measure respiratory volumes, so we can abandon this thing altogether, okay? We're not going to talk about disorders. We will jump straight to the review questions. So first of all, epiglottis, trachea, and left lung. So here's epiglottis, trachea, and left lung. Now next question, structure 1 here is called what? Epiglottis. So organs in the sequence, the flow chart. So from nasal cavities, air enters pharynx. Then from pharynx, it enters larynx. From larynx, it goes into the trachea. From the trachea, bronchi. From bronchi to bronchioles. And from bronchioles into the alveoli. Carbon dioxide isn't that much toxic to the cells, but it generates acid, and acid itself can disrupt cellular processes. So walls of alveoli are composed of what type of epithelium? We already figured it out. It's going to be simple squamous. We didn't talk about, medical term for collapsed lung, but I can just tell you it's pneumothorax. Pulmonary auscultation, listening to the lungs. So that's listening to the lungs. And the piece of equipment that you need to auscultate the lungs is stethoscope. Now B here is a tidal volume. In spirometry, which we didn't talk about, but spirometry is performed on patients to assess their respiratory function and the difference between the vital capacity and the residual volume. So vital capacity here, that's the volume of air that you can actually move in and out of your lungs. Residual volume here is the amount of air that stays in your lungs and not under your control. The gas exchange between the inhaled air in the blood within the pulmonary capillaries is an external respiration. So this concludes respiratory system, and our next video lab will be on the renal, and then reproductive, and then digestive.